All right, welcome to today's presentation, The Hierarchy of Carbohydrates. I'm Dr. Mike Roussel. I'm really excited about today's presentation because I think the hierarchy of carbohydrates is a really simple, I wanted to come up with something that was very practical, that really sugared down, no pun intended, all the kind of essentials of carbohydrate restriction when it comes to weight loss. And so I think you're going to find this is going to be really a very practical presentation. You're going to be able to get a lot out of this, and it's going to that you can apply to your diet. And then it's also going to answer a lot of questions that you have about carb cutting and carbohydrate restriction. So let's get started. Brief overview of things that we're going to cover. We're going to cover confusion about carbohydrates. We're also going to cover carbohydrate restriction at various levels. So one of the things that I'm going to use, one of the phrases you'll hear me use throughout the presentation is carbohydrate restriction. And so carbohydrate restriction is a phrase that I like to use because what we're going to talk about is how if you just cut your carbs a little bit, you're going to get some sort of benefit. So it doesn't need to be low carb, but you just need to restrict carbs at some level. So that's why I'll use the phrase carbohydrate restriction. We'll look at the dietary spectrum of carb cutting, and you can see when we get into this carbohydrate restriction, there are a lot of different ways and different levels in which you can cut carbs. Talk about carb cutting for fat loss, and then we'll really get into the hierarchy of carbohydrates, looking at each one, each food group in the hierarchy, and then at the end, kind of a practical application, how you can apply this to your own fat loss diet. So let's get talking about carbohydrate confusion. And carbohydrates are really confusing. And one of the reasons is that they can be grouped. There's so many types of carbohydrate containing foods, and there are so many types of carbohydrates. So if we look at grouping carbohydrates, something that pretty much everybody has heard and has a general idea of what it means would be simple versus complex carbohydrates. So when we look at simple versus complex carbohydrates, this is usually, you'll also hear described as fast and slow carbohydrates. But the simple and complex naming, kind of those definitions, have to do with the chemical structure of the carbohydrates. So simple carbohydrates are, just simple single molecules, whereas complex carbohydrates are carbohydrates that are bonded together, maybe in a branched structure, and these are thought to digest slower, whereas simple carbohydrates are digest faster. But really, this is a very bad way to categorize carbohydrates because there are complex carbohydrates that have very rapid and aggressive effects on your blood sugar. So just because something is a complex carbohydrate doesn't mean it's slow digesting, and it doesn't mean that it's going to cause slow increases in your blood sugar levels. There are a bunch of complex carbohydrates that are going to have cause very rapid rises in your blood sugar. So I really don't like the simple versus complex categorization. So the next way that carbohydrates are often categorized is glycemic index. And so this graph does a really good, very simple way of explaining the glycemic index of a carbohydrate. So the glycemic index of a carbohydrate is basically a rating system. It's a rating system that we use for carbohydrates. Foods that have a high glycemic index are going to cause a high and fast rise in your blood sugar levels. Foods that have a low glycemic index, as shown in this graph, are going to have a low and slow effect on your blood sugar levels. They're going to cause a low and slow increase in your blood sugar levels. So the glycemic index is really good, and it really talks about more of kind of the chemical and structural properties of a carbohydrate. But, there is a lot of criticism about the glycemic index, kind of the methodology, if it really translates when you start adding in other foods like proteins, carbohydrates, other carbohydrates, adding in fats into the mix, which is really how we eat a lot of our meals. But despite all its criticisms, the glycemic index is a pretty good way of kind of describing and categorizing carbohydrates. Then another one that's become a lot more popular when we talk about types of carbohydrates would be whole grains. And I'm sure you've seen this sticker before on foods that contain whole grains, right? 8 grams per more or more per serving, and it says here eat 48 grams or more of whole grains daily. So whole grains, yes, whole grains are good. They're better than refined grains, but is eating more of them really going to give you a great health benefit? I really would say no. I say we don't know. I think eating more, the research would suggest that eating whole grains over refined grains is definitely better. But would you be better off to eat more whole grains or just less total carbohydrates? I really think that the answer points to less total carbohydrates. So, and this really brings us to an important point, I think, with nutrition in general, that it's all, when you're looking at nutrition, this food's good, this food's bad, which is how a lot of people like to talk. I should eat more of this, less of this. Everything's relative. So yes, if you had the choice between refined grains and whole grains, choose the whole grain option because you'll get more nutrients, you'll get more fiber. But if you had the choice between a non-whole grain and, say, a green vegetable, I would choose the green vegetable, right? They'll give you even more nutrients, different nutrients, but less carbohydrates and less calories. You'll probably feel fuller with the green vegetables as well. So just kind of another example, whole grains are really kind of touted at the moment. They're really being pushed and marketed very hard. But I really think that the reality is when you look at the research behind supporting the benefits of whole grains, it doesn't suggest or show that they are this unbelievable food. Hands down better than refined grains, but I think that's really kind of where it stops. So now if we look at carbohydrate restriction at various levels, you can see, and one of the things that I really don't like is when people talk in very relative terms. This happens a lot with protein, and it happens a lot with carbohydrates as well. But you can see here, if we're going to talk about a diet, a high carbohydrate diet, right? So if you were talking to, say, Dr. Atkins, who created, or really not created, but really popularized a very low carbohydrate diet, and he were to say, well, that's a high carbohydrate diet. For him, a high carbohydrate diet is maybe 30% of calories, right? Because for someone like Dr. Atkins, they're looking a very low carbohydrate diet. They're like 10% of total calories. Whereas the dietary guidelines, or say my pyramid, right, is about 55 to 60% of total calories. And that people who prescribe that kind of diet don't really consider that high carbohydrate at all. So it's hard when we use these relative terms, but I'm going to use them here and then give you specific examples about them. So we say high carbohydrate, then we have moderate to high carbohydrate, moderate carbohydrate, reduced, and then very low carbohydrate. So if we look at the high carbohydrate diets, this would be something like the Ornish diet. The Ornish diet is about 70 to 75% of calories from carbohydrates. It's very, very low fat as well. So that's the diet that I know of which has the highest amount of carbohydrates. Then if we look next down, say a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, this category would be something like my pyramid or my plate. Also the DASH diet, which is a diet used in the treatment and prevention of both cardiovascular disease, like lipids, like your LDL, lowering LDL cholesterol, and also improving blood pressure. That is about half, so about 50 to 55% of your calories are going to come from carbohydrates. So I would consider that moderate to high. Then when we get down to, say, a moderate carbohydrate diet, an example of that would be a zone diet. Now, zone is synonymous with the 40-30-30 macronutrient breakdown, where about 40% of your calories come from carbohydrates. So slightly less than what you would get with the DASH diet or something from the dietary guidelines, and almost half of what you would get with an Ornish diet. Next, reduced carbohydrate diet. We consider that something like a paleo type diet. So we're looking at less. I know a lot of paleo folks kind of tout a zone 40-30-30, but most people who practice paleo, like a Paleolithic way of eating, really don't get enough carbohydrates, and they eat so much fat that they never get their carbs up high enough. So that would be, say, a reduced carbohydrate diet. And then if we look at the lowest level, a very low carbohydrate diet. And for very low carbohydrate diets, this is really where we're talking about ketogenic diets or Atkins style diets, diets when you're only getting, say, between 20 and maybe 50 grams of carbohydrates per day. So not very much. Now, when we look at carb cutting, one of the things about carb cutting is carb cutting is going to optimize fat loss. Now, when you start with diet, you want to cut carbohydrates over proteins and fats because carbohydrates, when you eat them, directly stimulate your body to release a hormone called insulin. So insulin is a hormone whose job is essentially the opposite of fat loss. If we think about fat loss, right? Fat loss is about taking energy from within a fat cell and getting your body to unpack it and then release it into your system so your body can use that stored energy. So we're taking energy out of cells so your body can use it. Insulin's job is to basically take energy or sugar from your bloodstream and stuff it into cells. So your body doesn't like to do things that work counter to each other. So your body's not going to want to be putting sugar into fat cells while at the same time taking fat and taking it out of fat cells. So insulin has the opposite action of what we're looking for with fat loss. So as we reduce carbohydrates in our diet, our body's going to release less insulin, right? Because that carbohydrate stimulus isn't going to be there anymore. And thus it's going to make it more optimal, your hormonal environment is going to be more optimal for when it comes to fat loss. And you can see here we have, but as kind of a nice graphical representation of what happens when it comes to when you cut carbs and lose weight. So there was a meta-analysis that looked at weight loss trials, and at 6 months into weight loss, the low carbohydrate groups lost about 9.2 more pounds than a higher carbohydrate group. Now, when you look at 12 months, the groups had about equal weight loss. But I would say this is less to do with carbohydrates and more to do with the function of weight loss studies. At 12 months, pretty much all weight loss diets work the same. And while we don't have a very kind of crystal clear answer for the cause of this, my hypothesis or kind of my feeling about it is it has less to do with the diets and more to do with the people sticking to the diets. And that just between 12 and 6 months, the mechanics of the study change. People don't get as much face time. They don't get as much support from those study researchers. They're left on their own a little bit more. And when that happens, people just don't stick to their diet plans as well. So there's nothing magical from a biochemical standpoint that happens between 6 and 8 months. I think it's more of a behavioral thing. So one of the things about carbohydrates is we talked about is they're very confusing. So I want to show you how we can clear up this confusion with a couple very simple tried and true fat loss rules, and then show you how the hierarchy of carbohydrates fits right in there to help you and support these rules. So here are the 2 rules. The first rule is the more weight you have to lose, the less carbohydrates you should eat. Okay, so this is very simple. So if you have to lose 50 pounds, you're going to be eating a lot less carbohydrates than a person who, say, only has to lose 5 pounds. Okay, really simple. And what happens when we cut carbs in this fashion is that it's going to reduce calories and carbohydrates. So you kind of get a double-pronged approach. And when we're reducing carbohydrates, we're going to get better insulin control, less secretions of insulin, so it's going to make fat loss more optimal. And also, generally, the more weight you have to lose, the less the lower efficiency kind of your body has with insulin. So your body's not as well. In diabetes, which is an extreme example of this, it's called insulin resistance. So maybe you have to lose 50 pounds. Your doctor might not classify you as insulin resistant, but you're definitely not insulin efficient. And so when we lower your carbohydrates, we kind of take that roadblock away from your physiology and away from your body so you can lose weight more easily. So the second rule, kind of overarching rule of fat loss, which also plays really well into the hierarchy of carbohydrates, is that you want to lose fat while eating as many calories and as many carbohydrates as possible. Okay? Now, this goes counter to what a lot of people do. A lot of times when you start a diet, maybe you've done this in the past, you start a diet and you just start restricting, and you restrict and you restrict, and you cut carbs and you cut calories and you cut all this stuff, and you lose weight initially, right? You're going to lose a lot of weight because let's say you're eating 2,500, 2,700 calories per day, and all of a sudden Day 2, you're eating 1,500 calories per day, right? That could be about 1,000 calorie deficit or more. So of course your body's going to respond with a lot of weight loss. But then your body's going to catch up, right? And it's going to adapt. Your body is amazing at adapting. And so once it adapts and it increases kind of mechanisms that make it more efficient. So it starts to eke every single, morsel of energy that it can out of the calories that you're feeding it. Then all of a sudden you don't lose weight at 1,500 calories anymore. So what do? You have to restrict calories even more. So maybe you're down to then 1,200 calories. And then what do you do when your weight loss stops? You got to restrict any more. And then you're like under 1,000 calories per day. And it's a very dangerous, unhealthy place to be. So what you want to do instead of doing that, and then you deal with the whole, if you're eating, say, 1,000 calories per day and doing all this exercise to lose weight, what happens when you're done losing weight, right? It's a lot harder because most people, to be completely honest, don't have the patience to slowly add back 100, 200 calories a week until they get back up to their normal calorie intake. No, they just go back to eating normal, right? Eating 2,500 calories per day, and then the weight just piles back on. So instead, what I want to do, what I would suggest you do, is you lose fat while eating as many calories and as many carbohydrates as possible. And this means taking small, stepwise reductions in the foods that you're eating. So you're going to reduce some food, then you're going to watch, and your body's going to lose weight, and it's going to lose weight, and then eventually you'll plateau, right? And then you restrict a little bit more food, and then you're just going to lose weight, and then you'll plateau. And you just keep repeating that process slowly. And what you're going to find is that you're going to be able to eat a lot more, right? Yes, you're going to come to more kind of, I like to call them weight loss steps, not necessarily weight loss plateaus, right? But they occur naturally anyway. And it's going to be a lot easier. It's going to be a lot more pleasant way to lose weight. And in the end, when you're kind of towards the end of your weight loss, you're going to be eating a lot more calories than you would have otherwise. So this is a very important and often overlooked rule. So how do you do this? You do kind of these stepwise reductions. You can achieve this via the hierarchy of carbohydrates, because we're going to take it and we're going to take these stepwise reductions in carbohydrates, each time getting your body to elicit a little bit more weight loss, and then when it stops, we'll elicit a little bit more weight loss by taking out another group of carbohydrates. And that's really where I think a lot of the magic and kind of practical efficacy of the hierarchy of carbohydrates comes from. So let's get right into this, into the hierarchy of carbohydrates. And one of the reasons why I like the hierarchy so much when I came up with it is because it's a practical food-based method. It doesn't involve counting calories. It doesn't involve a lot of minutia and micromanagement. It's food-based and it's very practical. So you can put it into action without really thinking too much or putting too much effort into it. It can just kind of flow as part of your life, as long as you're willing to meet and follow certain simple guidelines. And it's also good because it answers a lot of questions about carbohydrates. So at the beginning of the talk, we took some time to go through, some confusing topics about carbohydrates. Simple versus complex, high versus low glycemic, whole grain versus refined grain. But there are still a lot of other questions that people have. So common questions would be, how low should my carbs be, right? Or should I be eating whole grains? You'll hear, clients will tell me all the time, well, I hear whole grains are good for me, so I try to eat whole grains. Is that appropriate or not? And then maybe, well, will fruit make me fat? Should I stop eating fruit? Is that going to make me fat? Is that stopping weight loss? Or should I eat it because they're full of vitamins and minerals, right? That's another question. Or can I have pasta and still lose weight? Which carbs shouldn't I eat? Pasta's okay, but rice is not okay. What about potatoes? Right? There are all these kind of questions when you start getting into kind of the action of your weight loss diet that come into play just around carbohydrates. So we're going to simplify all these things with the hierarchy. So here's the hierarchy of carbohydrates. At the top, we have added sugars. Then we have refined grains, whole grains and starches, fruits, vegetables, and then green vegetables. And we're going to go through each one of these kind of step by step so you know exactly what we're talking about. And they're also laid out in great detail in your handout. Some of them are self-explanatory. Green vegetables or fruits, right? No problem. Added sugars, maybe you're not really sure what would that be, so we're going to go through all those. So the first thing, added sugar. Foods containing added sugar. So added sugar is a very broad and big term, especially in our food supply. And you're going to need to get into seeing what does and doesn't have added sugar, you're going to need to get into reading food labels and ingredients. And so here's the thing when you're looking at ingredients. The first food in the ingredient list is going to be present in the largest amount. And then as you progress down the list on the ingredients, the last is going to have the least amount. Because added sugars are so prevalent, maybe there'll be one of these components, and we'll kind of talk about, I'll read off a list for you of what's considered added sugar, right? Maybe one of these things, like say maple syrup, right, could be found in this really nice whole grain bread that you wanted to purchase. And it's like 10th or 11th on the list of ingredients. I say something like that is fine, right? We really want to get top 3, top 5. That's what we're really trying to avoid when it comes to added sugar, because those are going to be in really high amounts. And sometimes when you start reading food labels, you actually get kind of disgusted, because you'll look at a food and you'll see in the top 5 ingredients, sometimes 3 of the 5 are sugar, but just all by different names, right? So it's great to start reading food labels, and it's really eye-opening. But so when we're looking at added sugars, so what constitutes added sugar? Things would be white sugar, brown sugar, raw sugar, high fructose corn syrup solids, malt syrup, maple syrup, pancake syrup, fructose sweetener, liquid fructose, honey, molasses, anhydrous dextrose, and crystal dextrose. Right? So there's a lot of different ways to say sugar. And so those, like the list is in your handouts, but those are the things that you want to really start avoiding. Top of the list, the only time you would ever want something with added sugar would be with your sports drink or your workout drink, whether it's pre or post-workout nutrition, right? Then it's going to be liquid, so it's going to be sugar, whether it's a sports drink like Gatorade that's going to have sucrose and fructose, or if it's something like a more kind of exotic or higher-end sports drink, and maybe it's going to have dextrose and maltodextrose, right? Those are some other names for sugars. That's really the only time when I think added sugars are okay, unless you're having a kind of a splurge meal and you're off your diet plan and just kind of enjoying yourself. So the next up are refined grains. So refined grains are grains that have undergone processing such that 2 key components of the grain are removed. And specifically, it's the bran and the germ. And why these are so important is because these are the parts that contain the fiber and a lot of vitamins and minerals. And so oftentimes what's going to happen is when the grain gets refined, the bran and the germ gets removed, right? Then this grain is a lot more easily accessible to your digestive system, and it's digested a lot quicker. If we go back to that concept of glycemic index, right, that foods with a higher glycemic index are digested faster, they cause faster rises in your blood sugar. If you take a whole grain and then you take the refined grain version of that, the refined grain version is going to have a higher glycemic index because your body has to do less work to get at those carbohydrates and sugars, right? It doesn't need to crack through the bran and the germ to get to those things. And if you look at like kind of tables of the nutrient quality and the nutrient profile of whole and then their refined grain counterparts, it's amazing. You lose so much from a vitamin and mineral perspective. B vitamins, vitamin E, magnesium, all these things just get stripped away when you remove the bran and the germ. So nutritionally, they're a lot less nutrient dense, and then they're a lot less satiating. They're going to be a lot less satiating as well because they're going to be simple and they're going to be broken down to the more simple components that are more easily digested. So then next up on the hierarchy are whole grains and starches. So here we're looking at brown rice or brown rice and a wild rice mix. Now I include in this category things like whole grain pasta, whole grain breads, brown rice, quinoa, buckwheat, corn tortillas, and then from a starch department, things like potatoes would also fall in here. So while potatoes aren't technically a grain, they still are very carbohydrate dense. And though by definition, these foods, whole grains and starches, are complex carbohydrates, they can still be digested, those sugars and carbohydrates can still be digested rather quickly, causing larger rises in your blood sugar level. So they're more calorie and carbohydrate dense than the foods lower on the list that we're going to get into. So next up is fruit. So this is, people are always wondering, well, where does fruit come into play? So here's where fruit comes into play. And with fruits, we're basically just talking about all kinds of fruits. They could be tropical fruits like oranges, or they could be berries or apples. But this is where fruits come in with regards to your carbohydrate intake. One of the things about fruits that it's just important to note that I'm talking about whole fruits. Now, fruit juices, even if they don't contain added sugars, even if it's 100% fruit juice, I recommend that you don't consume them, right? Because the calories are very easily to consume. If you're trying to lose weight, it's very easy to consume. You could easily drink 3 apples worth of apple juice, right? Or apple cider. But it would be really hard. It's a lot harder to sit there and eat 3 whole apples. And after you did, you'd feel a lot different if you drank a large glass of, say, apple cider, which was the equivalent of 3 apples, versus you ate 3 apples, right? Think about how you'd feel afterwards. You'd feel a lot different afterwards. You'd be a lot more full after you chomped through and ate and digested the 3 apples versus the juice. Juice is just too calorie and too carbohydrate dense, and it's not satiating enough. And nutritionally, it doesn't give you that much of an advantage, really. If anything, you lose some nutrition when you go juice because you lose that fiber and some of those nutrients. So I recommend that you avoid the fruit juices when we're talking about weight loss. And oftentimes, for the most part, even in non-weight loss scenarios, when you're looking to maintain your weight, it's just a source of calories that are just too easy to consume that you don't really need. So when we're talking about fruits, we're talking about whole fruits, eating the fruit itself. So beans and legumes, if you'll remember back when I showed you the initial hierarchy of carbohydrates, they weren't on the chart, and I looped those in with vegetables. So we'll talk about beans, legumes, and vegetables together. And when we talk about removing carbohydrates, they're going to come in around that same time. They're a little more carbohydrate dense than a majority of vegetables, but we still kind of group them in there because they're generally much slower digesting. Their digestive profile is much more similar to vegetables, so we incorporate those. But with beans and legumes, we're talking about here chickpeas, black beans, kidney beans, black-eyed peas, any kind of bean or legume that you want to have. Now vegetables, this slide I guess is kind of funny because tomatoes are technically a fruit, but we're going to use them as kind of the poster child for vegetables. So with vegetables, now we're talking about non-green vegetables. So vegetables as a category, these could be things like tomatoes, onions, butternut squash or acorn squash, eggplant, and other similar non-green vegetables are going to fall in this category. Now these foods, as you can see as we're moving down the list, these foods are a lot less calorie dense, they're a lot less carbohydrate dense, and they have a lot more nutrients than things higher up on the list. And that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later, that you'll notice as we move down the hierarchy, the foods become less calorie dense, right? More calories, like foods with added sugars are going to have a lot more calories than, say, foods down here where we're talking about vegetables, a lot less calories. Vegetables are going to have a lot of nutrients, whereas at the top of the hierarchy, something like refined grains and foods with added sugar are going to have a lot less nutrients. And that's also, if we were to add a third, say, weight loss rule, it would be to eat more nutrient-dense foods, more foods that have vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants, because these are the foods that are generally going to be lower in calories. Just kind of how Mother Nature did it, that the more nutrient-dense, the less calorie-dense. So then the last category is green vegetables. Now, green vegetables really should make up a bulk of your diet. And with green vegetables, they're very low in calories, they're very low in carbohydrates, they're high in fiber, and we're talking about things like broccoli, cabbage, peppers, scallions, Brussels sprouts, kale, spinach, lettuce, all those things. It's pretty easy. If it's vegetable and it's green, this is where it comes in the hierarchy. And these foods are great because they have a lot of bulk, a lot of volume from internal water, but not a lot of calories. So now, how are we going to apply this? Let's look at the practical application of the hierarchy. So when you're going to lose weight and you want to start your diet, what you do is you start at the top of the hierarchy and you start removing foods, right? So initially, added sugars and refined grains really shouldn't be in your diet anyway, but if they are, right, let's get them out. So those would be the first ones to go. So we get rid of those, and then you'll slowly kind of chip away. The next ones to go would be whole grains and starches. So if we go back to a question like with fruit, am I eating too much fruit? Is fruit making me fat? Should I remove fruit from my diet? Well, according to the hierarchy, what I've created for you here, if you're still eating whole grains and starches, then you don't want to be removing fruit yet. Remove the whole grains and starches first, because those are going to be more calorie and more carbohydrate dense, right? And so we'll remove those first, and then you get down to fruit. Then you're at a diet that the carbohydrate makeup is basically fruits, vegetables, and green vegetables, right? And then if you need to further reduce calories, then we can start cutting out fruit. But so that's how it's going to work. And now when we look at building, right? So weight loss, fat loss, people are always talking about remove, remove, remove. Remove this, remove that. We look at the flip side of the coin, eat. What do you want to eat? Eat more of what? And so you want to eat more from the bottom, right? I don't want to call it I stayed away from kind of the pyramid message and kind of the pyramid idea, but you want this pyramid, this big foundation from the bottom. So we eat more of the foods at the bottom, more green vegetables, more non-green vegetables, and then less fruit, and then even less whole grains and starches, and then just a tiny, tiny bit of refined grains and added sugars, if at all, right? But so you eat from the bottom up and you remove from the top down. Really kind of very simple and practical. So now this is how we would put it into play, say on a week by week, how your fat loss diet might play out. So initially we cut out added sugars and refined grains. And you want to maintain that, keep eating in that way until your weight loss plateaus. So maybe it's 3 or 4 weeks. I would like you to keep like a weight loss plateau. I don't really call it a plateau unless it's 2 or 3 weeks, right? 1 week, it's easy to go a week. You don't lose weight 1 week and then next week you lose 2 or 3 pounds. Like weight loss isn't linear, so have patience with this. But so once you've kind of hit this plateau, then you want to move out whole grains and starches. What we'll do is we'll move those directly after exercise. And one of the reasons we're doing that is because, one, it lets us keep your calorie intake higher longer. But what we're doing is we're shuffling around the carbohydrates in your diet and putting them at a time where your body is most ready to handle them physiologically. So exercise is truly the best diabetes drug there is. So exercise sensitizes your muscles to carbohydrates. And it creates an environment where your muscles are like carbohydrate sponges. So we'll move whole grains and starches. We'll move these carbohydrate-dense foods right after exercise and only eat them in that first, maybe second meal after you exercise. And that's going to shuttle those carbohydrates more directly towards your muscles to aid in recovery and muscle growth, which is a really important part of successful fat loss. So you'll maintain that intake until your weight loss plateaus. Again, another 2-week minimum before we really call it a plateau. And then we cut out whole grains and starches. So then we'll be eating fruit, non-green vegetables, legumes, and green vegetables. Maintain that intake until weight loss again plateaus for say 1 or 2 weeks. 2 weeks is better, right? You're in this for the long haul. You're in this to lose the weight and never gain it back. So it's okay if we take it a little bit slower. And then you're just going to continue this process, removing carbohydrate groups until your weight loss goal is achieved. And now really what's going to end up happening is once you cut out starches, and so then you're just eating fruits, vegetables and legumes and green vegetables, that's probably the lowest you're going to have to go. Very rarely are people going to need to then cut out fruit and then further cut out non-green vegetables to get down to a ketogenic or a very low carbohydrate type diet. If you're just eating green vegetables, you're pretty much at a very low carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic diet. Most people aren't going to need to go that low to continue weight loss, especially to get to a point where you're lean. Like say for a man, if you want to get down to say 8 or 10% body fat, you can do it by eating, some fruit, non-green vegetables, and green vegetables. You don't need to take it all the way down to go ketogenic. And remember, we want to eat as much as possible while still losing weight. So that's really key. But that's how you want to play out. That's how we're going to slowly remove things, see how the body responds, remove some more carbohydrates, reinitiate weight loss, remove some more carbohydrates, reinitiate weight loss until you reach your weight loss goal. And then when you start adding foods back, right? So then once you've achieved your weight loss goal and you start adding foods back, excuse me, you'll add them back kind of in the reverse order that you remove them. So if we just removed starches and grains, that was the last group that you removed, the first thing you're going to want to add back is starches and grains post-exercise. And then do that for a couple weeks. And then we'll add in, say, starches and grains at breakfast, right, if you exercise in the evening. And then so you add them back at breakfast. So then we added them, throughout the whole day. And then you can add back maybe the occasional treat refined grain after that. So we add them in a reverse order after we've achieved our weight loss goal slowly until our body then kind of starts to gain weight back. What you basically want to do is you're kind of titrating or figuring out your exact personal carbohydrate tolerance. Because research shows that it's really important that kind of your own physiology, how your body processes carbohydrates, makes a big impact on your weight loss success, and then matching your carbohydrate tolerance with appropriate carbohydrate intake is really important. That sounds confusing, but you can do it very simply using this hierarchy of carbohydrates and the methods that I've just described. So I hope that has been really helpful for you. I hope that the hierarchy of carbohydrates has kind of set off a few light bulbs for you and shown you a really simple way that it's really simplified carbohydrates, answered a lot of your questions about should I eat these carbohydrates, should I eat those, when should I eat them, how much should I eat them if I'm not losing weight, if I'm trying to lose weight. Hopefully I've kind of streamlined it all for you with the hierarchy. Now if you have any other questions, just post them right below the video. And I'm more than happy. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your questions, and I'll answer them in the comment section right below. But if you haven't already, print out the handout that goes along with this presentation so that you have it, and then ask any questions you have below, and I'll make sure that I answer them so we can get you on the right track. Okay? So thanks so much for allowing me to be your nutrition coach, for watching this presentation. And I hope you got a lot out of it, and make sure that you pick up and watch a lot of the other presentation seminars that we have at microcell.com. All right, thanks a lot. Have a great day.